Welcome to the Ask Why podcast, a series of conversations exploring the future of learning and the future of work with experts ranging from professional educators to investors, company builders, and individual learners. The way we learn and the way we work is changing rapidly. Artificial intelligence is automating ever more tasks around us, putting pressure on all of us to reskill and upskill at accelerated rates, while dealing with a level of unprecedented information overload. The education system, built for an age of information scarcity and around a broadcast model of teachers and learners, is simply no longer fit for purpose. But what can be put in its place? If this is a topic you're interested in, I invite you to subscribe to our podcast by searching for #AskWhy in your favorite podcast app, or follow us on YouTube or TikTok and catch the video feed of these conversations, which are happening in VR. Today's guest is Lynn-Matern. Jan and I have known each other for about 6 years now. He's the founder and partner at Emerge Education, one of Europe's most active seed funds investing in solving the skills gap, and has been working on solving problems in education at Emerge for over 10 years. As a disclaimer before we start, I'm an investor in both of Emerge Education's venture funds.
My name is Jan. I'm the founder and one of the general partners at Emerge. And Emerge is a early stage fund based in Europe focused on investing in companies that democratize access to opportunity. And what that means is that we, broadly speaking, invest in companies that improve access to education, improve education quality, and then improve education outcomes. We're mainly focused on post-secondary education and adult education, both B2B and B2C. But really always harking back to that ultimate idea that we want to create an impact and want to democratize access to opportunity. And then the kind of unique way that we approach it is that our mission is to build the best first check for EdTech founders. And our thesis around that is, we need to be relentlessly focused on the early stage. B, we are thesis driven, so we strive to be thought leaders and thought partners to our founders in the specific sectors that we're focused on. And C, and most importantly, we're community driven. So we have this incredible group of venture partners sitting around Emerge, which Joshua, you're part of, who are very successful entrepreneurs, operators, and significant budget holders within the education industry who invest in our fund, help us source deals, help us diligence them, co-invest with us in our best companies, and sit on our companies' boards and advise them. And it's really that group and the collective intelligence that comes from it that gives us an edge in the work that we do. So that's us.
Yeah. Very impressed with everything you've been doing for the last few years as well. It's been a while, right? You've been doing this for like 10 years.
Yes. So yeah.
But Emerge,
Yeah, no, definitely. So basically, I got started, as you know, when I graduated from Oxford, and that was a long time ago. It was 10 years ago. And the reason I did it is because at that point, and still today, I was very focused on how can I create the biggest impact possible through my career. And I came across this concept of social entrepreneurship. So this idea that you could combine making a profit with making an impact, and thereby create systems that scale themselves to create an impact. And I just found it fascinating, and I knew I wanted to spend my career in this field. And then I realized I could either start one of these, or I could be involved in helping start many of them. And by doing that, I could really scale my impact. And so I fell in love with this idea of, at the time, creating an incubator for social entrepreneurs. And then it very quickly became focused on EdTech specifically, because we fell in love with that particular problem set, and we saw super interesting companies in it. And Emerge grew from there, and it grew into an accelerator program combined with an angel syndicate. We did deal by deal work for many years, built a great team, and then eventually raised funds and evolved it into what it is today. But yes, it's been an incredible experience.
Cool. And I did tell you there were 2-3 questions that I kind of gave you in advance. Then there are a bunch of questions today that that I will not have talked to you about, and one of those questions is generated by ChatGPT. And so at the end of the interview, I will ask you
Yeah,
which one you think it might be.
yeah, of course. Would not expect anything less of you.
Has to be done, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So, first question I ask everyone is, what is one thing that you believe to be true that most people in your industry would disagree with?
I think the kind of most fundamental belief about Emerge that most people in the VC industry would disagree with is that you can, in fact, create venture scale outcomes by investing in education companies. And the reason most people disagree with that is that, for several things. I mean, on the one hand, if you look at the past, not that many very big outcomes have been generated in the education industry. So there's a question of sort of, why hasn't it happened yet? And then on the other, I think people make the mistake of sort of lumping so many different things into the category of edtech or education that it becomes very difficult to see the business rationale for a lot of them, because so we invest in a very small subset of what's broadly considered the edtech market, and for a good reason, because we don't think the majority of what's happening in edtech is actually venture backable. But these things generally get lumped into one, and so people kind of think of businesses investing in schools and content-heavy businesses, etc., which don't really lend themselves to venture. So those are some of the things, the reasons why people don't believe it, and the reason I believe it is because actually, when you think about it, education technology companies solve like society level problems. So the kind of the levels of problems that we're thinking about here are, on the one hand, what drives the economy? Well, the economy is driven by capital and labor, and we need to invest in the education of workforce labor in order to make it more productive. And so how does that happen? What happens through the education system? And then secondly, if you look at individuals, what drives social mobility? Well, social mobility is driven by opportunities to access well-paying jobs and fulfilling jobs. And how do you get access to these opportunities? Well, you get them through great education. And so we think solving these kind of problems justifies building very, very big companies. So that's kind of at a macro level. And then if you look at it at a micro level, we think technology specifically has the potential to create very compelling impact on various different kind of micro problems that sit in the value chain of these kind of macro ideas that I've talked about, that lend themselves to building very, very big companies. That there's a massive global skills gap, and part of the reason it exists is because the education system just does not teach the right skills to people. We think technology companies can really address that. Whether it's quality of education, getting people really engaged with content and their education experiences in order to drive outcomes, or whether it's creating better pathways. So happy to go into sort of detail on very concrete ideas around these things, but that's why we believe there are really exciting companies to be built in education that can drive venture scale returns, and that justify not just individual investments, but a multi-fund, multi-decade approach to solving these kind of problems. And I think a lot of VCs still kind of believe the opposite is true, and that creates an opportunity for us.
Yeah. And so, going one level deeper, looking at specifically those areas where you do think there are kind of venture return opportunities, which are the ones that you are most excited by? The areas that you think kind of over the next 10 years are the most prone to return those big bets?
Yeah. The most important area by far is the global skills gap. So to explain that in a little bit more detail, what the skills gap is essentially a disconnect between what the education system is producing and what the labor market is demanding, right? So there is a shortage of highly skilled labor in areas, for example, in technology such as data, cloud, software engineering, etc. But also around deskless work. One particular skills gap that we're very excited by right now is the huge gap in highly skilled deskless workers that can help with the green transition. And this gap is getting bigger and bigger every day because actually demand for these roles is growing really fast, but education is not adapting quickly enough. And that can result in what Korn Ferry estimates to be an $8.5 trillion gap in global output between what could be achieved if we solve the skills gap and what is likely to be achieved in absence of a solution by 2030. So that's sort of the biggest macro driver that's sort of guiding most of our investments. And we think that can be addressed in many different ways. It's from changing what existing education providers, especially universities, teach. Going into universities, partnering with them, helping them partner with employers to build courses that are applied, project-based, that are focused on these skill areas, to just increasing the supply of education providers that do this kind of stuff, and making the delivery of this education more flexible. A lot of the upskilling and reskilling that needs to happen is actually not people at the start of their careers. It's people that are in work and that are either basically starting to be driven out of work by automation, or that are looking for opportunities to switch from dying industries to growing industries. But the way that education is catering to these people is actually not fit for purpose. They need courses that are or education services that can flex around their needs, their existing families, their work, etc. They don't want to go and spend three years on campus. And then lastly, it's about bringing employers into the mix. So a lot of this is about realizing that actually this problem can't just be solved by education providers alone, but rather that employers need to take responsibility for the development of the workforce as well. They need to invest in it, and they need to build the infrastructure to start helping deliver some of this upskilling. And so those are some of the kind of concrete ideas that we're working on.
What makes you interested in exploring kind of the employer university relationship? In if you're saying that right now some of the infrastructure is no longer fit for purpose to deliver the skills required to bridge this skill gap, what makes you look at the current system to work with it rather than kind of more new or different approaches to the same problem? Like how are you thinking about the mix between these two, kind of working with the existing one versus kind of ones that are coming in from an entirely different angle?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I guess to start with, looking at our portfolio to date, I'd say it's split roughly 50-50. 50% companies that are working with the existing system to ameliorate it and to address some of these challenges, 50% companies that are trying to disrupt the existing system and go around it. And in a way, we're sort of hedging by doing both. But to more directly answer your question, why not just disregard the existing system and completely focus on the second category? I think the answer to that is the majority of demand, i.e., where do people actually want to go to get their training and their education? Still, whether it's rational or not, is focused on higher education as the key destination for that problem. And so if you want to serve the millions and millions of people that are now getting, being elevated into the global middle class that are desperate to get a high quality post-secondary education, the way to work with these people and to meet their needs is not necessarily to try and educate them away from pursuing higher ed, but is to transform the higher ed offers that are available to them in order to both meet them where they are and to actually provide them with the services that ultimately will lead to the best outcomes. And the same is true for global employers. I mean, I guess the way to simplify this, it's sort of working with the existing system. It's more like pushing an open door on the demand side than trying to have to re-educate the entire market. And I mean,
Yeah.
would it be helpful to go into an example on this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so one of our companies is called Fourth Rev, and they basically the best way to describe them is that they provide an excellent alternative to a traditional master's program. And the way this alternative looks is that their courses are short, so they're about 6 months long, where a traditional master's program is between 1 and 2 years. They're cost effective. So they charge anything from like $6,000 to $8,000. A master's program could be, as much as $20,000 or $25,000. Some much more. And it is very employer aligned. So it is actually teaching you the things that will very likely lead to a career progression in some form, whether it's a promotion or a new job or a first job. And so far, so good. That sounds like a boot camp, right? But the way it's different to a boot camp is that Fourth Rev actually partners with elite universities in order to brand these courses and to market these courses. And also in order to get some of the academic rigor that you would get at a university in a master's program into these programs. So they infuse these programs with some academic stuff as well that's kind of co-delivered by the university. And so what that does is ultimately it just makes the program a lot more attractive to potential students, because they now no longer have to make this choice between a no-name boot camp, which is basically a commoditized industry and very difficult to sort of get signal from, but equally would provide probably the outcome and sort of the skill learning that they're actually after in order to get a career outcome that they're optimizing for, and a master's program which gives the signal top university, but doesn't necessarily give you that education, but they can get both in one, and that shows up in industry beating customer acquisition costs for these programs. And I think it's a great example of just how, like what I was talking about in theory there, about how you are pushing an open door, shows up in real life.
That's a really good example. Yeah, so it's it's basically leaning into the current system while the rest of the world is still seeing it as the main source of demand, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And now, kind of taking one step back, and looking at your personal life, kind of how you have developed. What was the best learning experience in your life, and why?
Yes, so I think by far it's building this company. And you were gracious enough to give me a heads up on this question, so I've thought about why. And the reason it's been such a, well, first of all, let me explain actually what this learning experience kind of, where it started and where it ended. So it started with me, with no track record, no trust fund, and no idea about what I was doing, deciding to go and build a venture capital firm. And that sounds like a recipe for disaster. And sort of 10 years later, it ended with me still being at the very beginning of my learning journey in many ways, but emerge as one of the leading EdTech investors in the world. And what I've learned on the way is sort of two things. One is how to be a good investor, and that's like how to generate proprietary deal flow, how to spot opportunities that ideally other people aren't seeing, to how to win deals, how to negotiate the deals, how to support the portfolio, how to manage the investment, the wider portfolio, how to fundraise, how to lead a team, how to hire, all this stuff. But at the same time, there is kind of learning about how to build the firm, like how to build a sustainable advantage that survives me. And the reason it's been such a good learning experience is because it was intense. I'm highly ambitious. My partners are highly ambitious, and we just really, really care about being the best in the world. And so there's this constant sense of urgency, and thus a strong motivation to go and be better, become better. It's highly applied. Everything we learn, we can immediately put into practice. It's intensely collaborative. I'm working with other people to put these things into practice, to test, to learn. And at times it's deeply reflective. Like when we're building, out our thesis, it's like long hours sitting in my bedroom with my eyes closed, trying to imagine the future of education, reading, thinking, etc., writing. And I think those are sort of some of the descriptors of great learning experience in general. And very, very lucky to have had this one. And maybe just the last thing I'll say on this is, I think kind of my learning experience with eMERGE has come in sort of two phases. So phase one was probably the first 3-4 years, where I was largely on my own. My partners were just coming into the business toward the end of that period, and the learning cycles were slow. And that was largely because venture capital, by its nature, is an industry where feedback cycles are very, very, very long. And so the way to learn it, you can't basically very easily learn about the quality of your investment decisions and such by looking at ultimate outcomes. You have to use proxies. But what I've learned over time is that actually the way to massively increase the frequency of your learning cycles is by bringing in experts, by having access to people who've been there and done it before, and to work with those to build out our thinking about the industry, to build out our approaches to building the firm, to investing, etc. And so in the last kind of 5 to 6 years, I've had a lot more access to some of the best brains in the industry, both on the education front and on the venture capital front, to help us do that. And so that's really increased the feedback loop and frequency. And that's maybe one thing I'd do differently. I'd somehow try and have that realization earlier.
That's interesting. So you'd say your learning has accelerated kind of in the last 4 or 5 years compared to the first 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. Yeah.
Cool. Interesting. You wrote at some point that today's education no longer provides the opportunities we need to. And I want you to expand a little bit about, like, what do you mean with that? And why do you think it's so important?
The broad trends over the last 70 years have been that access in Western democracies, but also all over the world, to education has been increasing. I think in the 50s we were at something like 12% higher education access. Now we're at possibly to a level of access of higher education penetration that's maybe too high. We can discuss that too. Similarly, primary education levels around the world have risen, secondary education, etc., etc. So these are all great things. And of course, there is an argument to be made that the purpose of education is to help you explore the knowledge of the world, build your curiosity, build schemes of knowledge that later in life, form the basis against which you subconsciously, make decisions and lead your life. And those things are all true. And in no way am I saying that the only purpose of education is kind of like career utility. But I do feel that career utility should be a big component of it, because we live in a world where you could argue that things are not necessarily going to continue getting better. Like you could argue that the the force of automation will eventually dislocate a lot of people, put them out of jobs, or at least automate away a lot of the tasks that they currently do. And it sort of poses the question, what are these people going to do? And at the same time, you have all these new opportunities that are being generated, but where it's difficult to fill open roles and find the skilled labor. So I see education as the obvious answer. So the education system needs to basically help these people over here that are being affected by automation access these opportunities over here that are currently unfilled. And in that way, I'm saying education is currently failing people.
Okay. How do you think about the dynamics between companies wanting to produce value and so doing whatever needs to be done, the type of company that creates that value, versus universities that or higher education provides a pipeline of people able to help with those types of challenges?
Yeah, I know. I think sort of the incentives to create change against this context apply to every major stakeholder, from government to employer to the education system, i.e. higher ed, schools, and then to individuals as well. And I think everyone has a role to play. I think government schemes like the UK's apprenticeship levy are a fantastic example of where government can make a great impact in terms of moving the education system in the right direction. Of course, I think that there is a economic imperative on higher education institutions to adapt with the times or risk becoming slightly less relevant over time. But there's also moral responsibility for them to do so. But as I said earlier, I think one of the biggest things that needs to change is that employers need to start seeing themselves as sort of an extension of the education infrastructure. And one of our investment theses, is that employers are not set up to do this, especially SMEs that don't have the size of back office to be able to run internal academies and bring best practice into the company to educate their workforces. And so that's where one of the kind of areas where we invest is in companies that basically build centralized education services that are specific to certain industries or niches that you can then sell into employers to help them play their part.
Okay. How do you think about the risks that get introduced by having more and more of this infrastructure kind of out of the hands of the individuals, right? So kind of universities adapting a little bit more, becoming better at producing these skills, then employers taking over and kind of providing the infrastructure. How would you react against the statement that this might actually lead to an environment where the individuals, even though they are they're being handheld along the journey, and if as you say, we might end up in a place where some of these jobs are getting displaced through automation, and kind of we end up with a problem there. How will, without the infrastructure around them, these people at that point continue to drive value in their own lives, to continue to drive to make a living and live, if that makes sense?
So are you basically saying I'm presenting here some sort of vision where I'm requiring the education infrastructure and employers to sort of handhold a person through their kind of lifelong learning journey, and where's the individual's responsibility in all of this? Is that basically what you're saying?
So maybe if individual responsibilities is one thing, but I guess what are the is there an element that is missing that is really about lifelong learning, habit creation, that kind of is intrinsically motivated versus extrinsically kind of pulled out of individuals, either through a university system kind of, or through workplace management? What is the best mix to get to the result where people are able to learn but also are not dependent on the system around them, but somehow are able to take ownership of it, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And I think it's sort of one of the key questions, basically. and don't think there is an easy answer to this one, but essentially what you're talking about is um, all the information in the world is out there and available on the internet, and if you wanted to, you could be an expert in anything, within a matter of months or years, if you just applied yourself to this information that's
Yeah.
available. So why do we still have social mobility problems, etc.? And obviously the answer to that is that it isn't that easy. There are environmental factors that affect your ability to engage with this. Maybe you simply don't have the time because you're looking after people, or you're struggling to make a living. Maybe you don't have the confidence to engage with it. Maybe you've never learned how to learn autodidactically. But ultimately, I think it's just a question of, we're motivated by to learn by certain things that are just not present in a situation where you're sitting in front of a laptop and reading blog posts by yourself. We're motivated by some of the things I was talking about earlier about why building Emerge has been such a great learning experience for me. Things like linking the learning to a real world outcome. Like, I know that if I apply myself to this, I'm going to achieve this thing I want. Or making learning social, making it a social experience, making it fun, making it something that, well, the adjusting the difficulty of the content I'm engaging with to exactly the place where I am in my learning journey, etc. So there are basically things about the design of the learning journey that I think can have a great impact on the motivation of an individual that's engaging with it. And going back to what I was saying earlier about kind of why we believe there are great opportunities for technology companies to make an impact in the world and achieve venture scale outcomes, I think some technology companies are dedicated to doing these things, and to create to use technology in order to create these kind of learning experiences. And I think it's the holy grail essentially, but achieving this could be extremely impactful.
You've now been doing this for over 10 years. What is one thing that you fundamentally changed your mind on? Something that you kind of believed to be true back then that you now think at least decently different about, if not
Yeah.
entirely wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one big one, I think was, there's many, but one big one is, we used to invest in sort of anything edtech related, and we had a broad lens to say, look, if it's creating an impact somewhere in the education system, then we're interested a priori, and we'll look into the opportunities and invest in the best teams. What we've learned over time is that actually where we're sitting, with the kind of opportunities that are available to us, with the network that we have, and therefore the edge we can provide in terms of building companies and helping entrepreneurs, we're best focused on companies that focus on post-secondary education and adult learning in the main, and then we make some exceptions around that. So we've completely stopped investing in companies that sell into the K-12 sector. And that's not to say that you can't build great companies in it. It's just not. It's not something that we believe in or we want to do. So that's a huge one. And then I think our model has just completely changed over time as well. This concept of our venture partners was really not part of the initial vision for Emerge, but sort of has organically evolved, and it's been something that we've really doubled down on over the last few years. But it's sort of learning by doing, and seeing just how big an impact this kind of decentralized approach to investing has had on us. That's made us change our mind about how we actually invest, how we build value, and sort of how we differentiate against others in the space.
Yeah. And what's one question you have today that you wish you had an answer to?
One thing that I admit I haven't spent enough time on to even begin to answer, but that I wish some crystal ball would just tell me, is what is the right timing for setting up an Africa dedicated investment team? Because it is clear to me that the continent is sort of the next India and China in terms of the equity growth story for in EdTech. It will happen, and at the same time, when I spend time with entrepreneurs from the continent, there's the signal to noise ratio is still very high, very very low, and I'm not seeing enough of an opportunity there today to kind of fully dedicate myself to it. But over time, I think it'll be necessary for a global early stage fund to have a presence there. And so the question is just when. Now it feels like too early, but you don't want to miss the boat. You want to go in just at the right time.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you find the answer, please let me know.
Yeah. Well,
well, I'll be there.
Yeah, exactly.
When COVID happened, there was a very interesting experience I had, which is that, as you know, I started Mindstone literally second day of lockdown.
Yep.
And I still remember the first pitch that I went into just to get some finance to make sure that we could kind of go through COVID. And it was actually with Carlos from Camp. And it was a very fun interaction because basically I went through the pitch, and before I had even properly started, he said, wait, let me stop you. COVID has happened. Whatever you thought you were doing surely can't be the same anymore. So how has your thesis fundamentally changed? And it was like this massive slap in the face, which was very, very correct. Obviously, like the world had changed, so why the hell would the thesis you had before still hold? And it's kind of stuck with me ever since. Obviously, I adapted a bunch of different things. Obviously, the company is different now to what I would have thought before. But I feel that there's something similar to be said now with AI, which is that the last 3 months have seen a fundamental shift, at least in what people know is possible today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd like to kind of give you that same question, which is, how are you thinking about the landscape in education differently today than how you would have thought about it, say, 3.5 months ago?
Yeah. And by the way, did you fundamentally change your thesis as a result of COVID or as a result of other things?
Accelerated a bunch of trends that we had already been looking at, and it changed tactically how we thought about building the company, because the first few years we knew that people were going to be at home rather than going on their commute.
Yeah.
So like we made the decision to go web first rather than mobile first, because suddenly mobile usage dropped because of commuting time, stuff like that. But I definitely needed to have an answer to the question, because basically every single other conversation going forward had the same question, right? So
yeah.
that was the key learning for me.
No, definitely. Yeah, no, I think you're totally right that this moment is similar, at least in my view. And as it's a really interesting question how it will impact education broadly, and then how it will impact edtech company creation and investing in edtech. And yeah, thinking about sort of education more broadly, so the first killer application for AI, or for, let's say, for ChatGPT, right? Because this is what kicked this whole thing off, is obviously cheating on your homework, which is having all these interesting effects. There's some schools like the New York schools district, banning the use of ChatGPT. There's probably some more forward-thinking teachers that are advocating actually using it. I think we'll go through this, normal cycle of what happens when new technology is introduced to the world, where there's panic, there's rejection, and then eventually it just becomes part of life, and we're going to figure out how to work with it in education. And probably if we're asking questions in a few years from now, where it's possible to get a pass grade just by putting the question into ChatGPT, then we're asking the wrong questions, right? So I think it's actually going to potentially have really positive impacts on how we teach and how we assess by forcing us to rethink these kind of things. So that's sort of, I think, what's happening immediately in the short term, what everyone's talking about in education. But I think where it gets more exciting is seeing teachers starting to realize that actually they can use it to optimize their workflows, not just students realizing it. And I was speaking to a teacher the other day who was moaning about how many essays they had to assess before the like that night or whatever, and then their kid got them to get out ChatGPT, and ChatGPT graded the essays for them. And
yes,
and sort of a light bulb went off, right? So it probably was grading essays that were in the first place generated by ChatGPT as well. So teach, educators more broadly, and I include EdTech providers that have a teaching element as part of their product in that as well, are using it for things like creating learning objectives, creating a curriculum, a lesson plan, mapping out a learning path for a given learner, given where they are at right now and where you want them to go, etc. And so it's creating all these potential efficiencies and preparing for lessons or creating learning experiences or doing the learning experiences that are potentially exciting and that potentially have sort of wider impacts on edtech. And then so to get into some like concrete examples, one area that I found really exciting to think about is assessment of knowledge and assessment of skills and how to use it there. So I've been speaking to this company that is building a pre-interview candidate assessment solution, right? So you basically, rather than doing a screening interview, you send your candidates to this app, and they go through an assessment, and the assessments or the app spits out an evaluation of the candidates that allows the hiring manager or the HR person to basically interview fewer people, save time in the process, etc. And all of these questions have been generated by experts. But actually, if you go to ChatGPT, and I've been spending a lot of time, as almost every VC probably has, and if they haven't, then they're not doing their job, and been playing around with this kind of stuff, and I've been asking it to generate multiple choice questions on certain topics that I understand extremely well in order to test the quality of questions that it comes up with. And it does a great job, but I think it goes even further, because if do you know the concept of the diagnostic question?
Not enough, no.
So basically the idea that like the incorrect answers and of the multiple choices that you've got in the question give you an indication of the fundamental misconception that's leading to the incorrect answer. So that, like, an example would be, you ask a student for the area of a shape, and they give you the answer that would have been the answer had you used the formula for calculating the area of a different shape than the one that you're looking at. And then, so they're giving you 15 rather than 30, and okay, they're using the triangle area formula rather than the rectangle area formula to answer this question. Now I know what misconception they have. Now I know how to remediate that, right? So that's a diagnostic question. They're extremely powerful in helping assess gaps in knowledge and helping personalize an approach for a class, but they're extremely hard to generate because you obviously have to be very smart about each of the four answers, not just sort of making the correct answer obscure. But the point is, ChatGPT was able to generate really good diagnostic questions when asked.
I was going to say that seems like a perfect area for ChatGPT.
Yeah. So, this company I'm talking to about for these that's doing these kind of pre-interview screens, they're now exploring using generative AI in the question creation process, which is going to have obvious impacts on sort of efficiency of the process, allow them to enter more verticals more quickly, but also actually it's really useful because a lot of these kind of solutions get hacked by candidates really quickly. Like if a solution like this scales, you end up finding the questions that are generated by its experts on Reddit, because candidates share what they've just been through in terms of their experience, and then other candidates use that to prep and cheat. Whereas if these things were, generated dynamically, you obviously would be able to circumvent that sort of thing. So that's an interesting application. Probably when it comes to assessment, the even more exciting one is sort of trying to assess someone's skill level at, against a certain framework, purely on the basis of their language output, whether it's spoken or written, and sort of by observing their work, being able to infer their skill level, and then being able to do all sorts of other interesting things with that. And I know you've been playing around with that, but would love to kind of
I wonder where that comes from.
Yeah, well, would love to get your take on that. To me, that feels a little bit more tricky. I've been speaking to this other company who what they're doing is meeting summaries, right? And as I promise this is related back to this, but basically they will listen to a call transcript and then summarize the meeting. And from using tools like Otter and Firefly that the transcript is fine that they generate, but once they get into trying to summarize the meeting and sort of what were the pertinent things that were said here, what were the takeaways, etc., it's basically useless. You can't actually, get any value out of that. This company is trying to solve that by sort of teaching its tool how to chunk the conversation. So this is the part of the conversation where, Joshua and Jan were talking about, like, where they were prepping for this interview, and they were just having like a chit chat and talking about, okay, how long do we want to go on for, etc. This is the part of the conversation where Joshua asked that question, and yes, that is still Jan answering it 10 minutes later. And this is the part of the interview, the conversation where they were, talking about next steps or whatever. And then once you've taught it how to chunk, you can then apply different methods for assessing or summarizing each chunk. Like maybe a next step chunk is summarized in a different way than a conversation chunk about whatever. So applying it back to assessment, like if you're trying to figure out how good someone is at interviewing founders, is this VC associate that's applying for a job with Emerge good at interviewing founders? Like, you'd have to probably build something a little bit more sophisticated in order to chunk the conversation and then teach it how to assess different bits of the conversation in order to actually give me a summary that I find intelligible and interesting, rather than just feed the entire transcript of this associate, like interviewing a founder, to ChatGPT and asking it to summarize it or asking it to rate this person. So that's kind of where I'm sitting. And I think that's probably an area where there is a lot of value to be generated and captured by companies that do this in a really smart way. But I know you have a slightly different view on this. So maybe let's have a debate on it. I'd love to kind of hear your perspective.
I think that for a very long time, we have been talking about personalization in education, and it's consistently underdelivered all of the various approaches, whether that's through personalized assessment, personalized teaching, personalized learning, all of the various aspects. And I think one of the things that GPT seems to be good at is to tweak its output based on a set of parameters. Now, on the one hand, it is not perfectly accurate. And so this can only be applied to scenarios where accuracy is not 100% required. Like 100, what I do think, however, is that too many people are getting caught up in the fact that it is not 100% accurate, because actually most teachers are not. So you have lots of learning experiences where you are taught the wrong things. So if it is right more often than it's wrong, and if there are, I would say we have gotten past the point where now it is absolutely useful, and rather than trying to obviously it's good to make it more accurate, but I would say systems that try to build around the assumption that it is not going to be 100% accurate, but to build in loops that help you find the inaccuracies, spot them, and deal with them, are where you end up with really, really interesting things. So basically building systems that don't require 100% accuracy, but still dramatically improve the learning process as you go through them. That's kind of where I think the space is now ripe to really build from.
So help me
Yeah.
make it more concrete. Like, let's say I'm assessing someone's discovery skills in a sales call. So discovery skills are like asking really good discovery questions to understand what, you know, the needs of the prospect and figure out basically how to approach your sales, your sell plan to them.
Yep.
If I give it a transcript of a sales call today and I ask it to just point out which bit of it were discovery questions, or the part where there was a discovery conversation, it's going to not give a great answer. So how can it possibly then rate the discovery skills? So I get your general point, but I'd love to kind of get a kind of a practical idea of that, of what you're thinking there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So what makes you think that it doesn't discover great discovery questions? You have tried that and it didn't find the discovery
So
questions?
I think yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe discovery questions is the wrong example, but like as soon as you I think as soon as you have slightly more jargony or business specific logic, it starts getting imperfect.
Yeah, it starts.
It
starts to mess up. And
yeah.
So, in my experience, most of those problems come from two sources. Either the source text is not formatted well enough in a way that is basically removes kind of spelling mistakes, removes kind of blobbing it all together, but having a clearly structured text, maybe even indicating who is speaking at what point. So if you're talking about a transcript, having labeled transcripts rather than unlabeled transcripts would make a big difference. And the second bit is around the prompt, is that depending on how the prompt is asked, I have consistently been surprised in how much of an effect that has. And so I would be looking at refining prompts to get to a result that is more accurate. It won't be perfect, but again, I don't think we need to get to perfect. I think if you get to a 7 or 8 times out of 10 like hit ratio, you're able to make a very good starting assessment.
Yeah, I think we're basically saying the same thing. Like better labeling and better prompting is like another way of approaching what I'm talking about. So yeah.
But better labeling and better prompting are things that are known quantities today. Like there are apps out there that just help you label. So I'd say that is the world we
just to
live
be clear,
in today.
I'm not. When I was saying earlier, it gets trickier with this stuff. I wasn't in any way trying to suggest that it's not possible. I'm saying this is where there's an opportunity space.
Exactly.
This is where companies can create real value because the average consumer cannot get to the result, right? But a company can create the kind of system around ChatGPT or whatever model they're using in order to get to a really amazing result. And that's kind of that's the opportunity space that I'm interested in.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to give an example. Like, we have a portfolio company called Fundamates. They're a chatbot which is you can access through WhatsApp, and it's designed to be a study buddy for people on low data plans who can't browse the internet, but basically access the internet through WhatsApp. And to date, it's been focused on making educational materials more accessible. Like students use it to download past papers to practice, to define concepts, to help with maths problems. But what it's kind of starting to be, well, what users are starting to ask for more and more and more is like, this is my learning goal. help me get there, like help me generate the drills that I need to get there based on my knowledge. And so what they're building now is like trying to parse their own like proprietary database of all these past exams, and and it's labeled data because it's not just the questions, they also have like the model answers to the stuff. And basically getting to a point where they can generate completely unique mock exams that are uniquely fitted to that student's current level and learning goal. And for that, that ChatGPT couldn't necessarily do that because they don't have access to the data that sits behind a paywall, or that's proprietary data around the actual exam questions and the model answers and the specific curriculum that student is studying for or in. That I think is a particular like an interesting use case where they're obviously using the technology, but then they're building their own model on top of it, on top of their own data, in order to create something super useful.
Cool. Well, so we went through a bunch of questions.
Yep.
One of them was GPT generated, ChatGPT generated.
Oh my God.
Do you have any idea what it might be?
So what were your questions? So there's sort of beliefs that differ from the norm, best learning experience, unanswered question. There was, what do I mean by education failing to provide the opportunities that people need? What else did you ask?
Yeah. There was the role of employers and kind of the role of people directly within the university employer kind of trifecta. We talked about employer-university collaboration and how that was kind of a way to upskill. We talked about the areas of education that you were most excited about today, why, how your thinking has changed over the last 10 years. That was mostly it.
Okay. So my guess is that you fed parts of the manifesto to ChatGPT and then asked it, how one might challenge it, and that it came up with something like, this person seems to think that there's a big role for employers and universities to play in solving education system level problems, but they're kind of not mentioning individuals. What about individuals?
That was it. That was
yes!
the first one to actually get it.
Well, I've been spending a lot of time with it recently, in part inspired by you, and it just feels like the kind of thing that it would say.
Yes, absolutely. It was basically the idea, that employers' role within upskilling and reskilling, and kind of what's the role of individuals within that.
What was your actual prompt
equation? I just asked it to generate 10 non-obvious, thoughtful, divisive questions based on the manifesto.
Okay, amazing.
Fun
stuff.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great to see you. Speak soon.
Have a great day. Cheers.
Bye.
I'm your host, Joshua Vola, CEO at Mindstone, and I hope today's conversation shed light on at least some of the problems we're facing. If you thought today's conversation was interesting, I invite you to subscribe to our podcast by searching for #AskWhy in your favorite podcast app, or follow us on YouTube or TikTok and catch the video feed of these conversations, which are happening in VR.